They said the Duchess slipped. A tragic fall on a dim staircase. But the carpet was new. The grip was perfect. And the woman who had climbed those steps for 40 years would not suddenly forget them. Which leaves only two possibilities. Someone pushed her. Or she was never the woman who belonged there at all.
Welcome to Cafe Stories. I hope you're doing well wherever you're watching from today. Tonight's mystery begins with something that doesn't quite fit. A visitor who speaks carefully, a household that appears perfectly in order, and a question that seems simple until it isn't. This is a case where nothing is quite what it appears to be. And before we begin, I want to share this openly. Cafe Stories is currently demonetized by YouTube, which means I no longer get paid for the work I create here. If you enjoy these stories and would like to support my work, the only way to do so is through Patreon. The link is in the description. Now, let's begin. Duchess in Disguise. Chapter 1. The Woman Who Was Not What She Seemed. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, not a letter of consequence, said nothing to alter a man's morning, merely a note from my club regarding overdue subscription fees. I mention it only because I was reading it at the precise moment the doorbell rang, and because the contrast between that dreary little document and the visitor who followed was, in retrospect, rather striking. Poirot sat across from me, immaculate as ever, his patent leather shoes reflecting the grey October light from the window. He was engaged in the arrangement of a small collection of porcelain figurines along the mantelpiece, an activity he pursued with the solemnity of a general deploying troops. He had shifted a shepherdess 3/4 of an inch to the left and was regarding the effect with deep satisfaction when Miss Lemon's voice reached us from the hallway. "A Mrs. Brown to see you, Mr. Poirot. She has no appointment." Poirot set down the shepherdess. "Then by all means, show her in." She entered quietly. That was the first thing one noticed. Not her appearance, but the quality of her entrance, the way she crossed the threshold without hesitating, without the small shuffle of uncertainty that most unannounced visitors display. Her coat was dark wool, well brushed, but old. Her hat, a plain felt affair, sat at a sensible angle. Everything about her dress said woman of limited means, and said it with a kind of deliberate thoroughness that put one in mind, oddly, of an actor in costume. She was perhaps 65, with a lean, handsome face and grey eyes that moved across the room with a swift, appraising intelligence. "Mr. Poirot?" Her voice was clear and controlled. "I am sorry to intrude without notice. My name is Amelia Brown. I am employed as a companion to an elderly lady in Kensington. Please sit." Poirot gestured to the chair opposite him. "You know my friend Captain Hastings, I think? No? No matter. You will not object to his presence." "Not at all." She sat, and there it was again, that small betrayal. She did not perch, as companions and governesses perch, on the edge of the chair with their handbag clutched in both hands. She settled into it with an ease that spoke of a lifetime's habit of being comfortable in good furniture. Her hands, I noticed, rested open on her lap. The hands of a woman who had never scrubbed a floor. Poirot had noticed too. I could tell from the particular quality of his stillness, a stillness that in him indicated not relaxation, but the most acute attention. "You fear for your employer," he said. Mrs. Brown looked at him steadily. "I do. She is unwell. She is in excellent health. It is not illness I fear." Poirot placed his fingertips together. "Then you will tell me, madame, precisely what it is you do fear. And you will be as exact as possible. I find vagueness most fatiguing." Something moved in her grey eyes, not quite amusement, but its near neighbour. "She is an elderly lady of some means. She has recently made changes to her private arrangements, her household, her finances. There are people around her who would suffer considerably if those arrangements were examined closely." She paused. "I believe she is in danger." "From whom?" "I am not yet certain. That is why I have come to you." I leaned forward. "I say, have you spoken to the police?" "No." The word was crisp, final. "May I ask why not?" "Because," she said, with a patience that was itself a form of hauteur, "the police cannot move with discretion, and discretion in this matter is everything." Poirot regarded her without expression. "This employer of yours, she is aware that you have come to me?" A pause, brief but perceptible. "She is not unaware of my concern for her." It was not quite an answer, and we all three knew it. Poirot allowed it to pass. "You can give me the lady's name and address?" "Not yet." Mrs. Brown rose from the chair. It was done without apology, without the performance of reluctance. A woman accustomed to concluding conversations on her own terms. "I wished first to establish whether you were the right man to approach. I believe you are. I will be in touch within the week." She was at the door before Poirot spoke again. "One moment, madame." She turned. "Your employer?" he said, pleasantly. "She resides in Kensington, you say. Yet the mud on your left boot," it is clay, quite distinctive, "comes from the Embankment Gardens." "A long walk from Kensington." Mrs. Brown looked down at her boot. Then she looked at Poirot. Her expression did not change precisely, but something behind it shifted, a reassessment, quiet and rapid. "You are indeed the right man," she said, and left. I listened to the front door close and turned to find Poirot still gazing at the space she had occupied, his head tilted at the slight angle that meant his mind was moving at considerable speed. "Well," I said. "Rum sort of visit. Do you think there's anything in it?" "Oh, there is a great deal in it, Hastings." He rose and restored the shepherdess to its original position. The arrangement he had abandoned, I noticed, had not satisfied him after all. "That woman is not a companion?" "No. What is she, then?" "That," said Poirot, moving to the window and looking down at the street below, "is what makes it interesting." He watched the pavement for a moment, searching, I realized, for a glimpse of her in the street below. But Mrs. Amelia Brown had already gone, absorbed into the grey London morning as cleanly as a stone dropped into still water. 2 days later I came down to breakfast to find Poirot already at the table, the morning paper open before him. He had not touched his tisane. He sat quite motionless, reading something near the bottom of the front page, and the quality of his stillness was different from his usual composure. Tighter, more deliberate, the stillness of a man holding something carefully in check. I took the paper from him when he held it out. Duchess of Montreval dead. Her Grace found at foot of private staircase at Montreval House. An apparent fall. She was 71. I read it twice. Outside, a motor car horn sounded in the street, and somewhere below Miss Lemon's typewriter began its brisk morning rhythm. "Poirot?" "Yes," he said. He retrieved the paper, folded it with precise corners, and set it beside his untouched cup. I rather think, Hastings, that we shall be paying a visit to Montreval House this morning." He said nothing further. He simply sat, his green eyes fixed on some middle distance, his expression carrying that particular gravity he reserved for occasions when he had already seen, in outline, the shape of something terrible, and was measuring, quietly, just how terrible it might prove to be. Chapter 2. Montreval House. Montreval House did not announce itself. That was the first surprise. In a street of confident Edwardian facades, broad steps, bright brass window boxes planted with military precision, number 47 offered nothing. Black iron railings, stone the colour of old ash, a door so dark it seemed to absorb the morning light rather than reflect it. The house had the quality of a face with the expression deliberately removed. Poirot regarded it for a moment from the pavement, his hat in one hand, his eyes moving from the ground-floor windows to the first, to the second. Then he replaced his hat, mounted the steps and rang the bell. The butler who admitted us was elderly and correct. He showed us into a morning room and withdrew without a word. I looked about. The room was immaculate. Fresh flowers, polished surfaces, not a cushion displaced. Yet it had the feel of a room maintained rather than used, like a stage between performances. We waited perhaps 4 minutes before she came. Lady Imogen Vane was somewhere in her early 40s, with dark hair swept back from a face that was, and I choose the word with care, composed, not calm, composed. The way a piece of music is composed, deliberately, with effort, every element placed to create a particular effect. She wore grey, which suited the room, and may well have been intentional. "Mr. Poirot." She extended her hand. I was told Scotland Yard had referred certain inquiries to private parties. I assumed you might present yourself. "A small one, perhaps," Poirot said. "You will permit me to offer my condolences, Lady Imogen. The loss of a great lady." "Yes." The word was dry, not unfeeling, but stripped of sentiment. She seated herself and waited. "You will appreciate," said Poirot pleasantly, settling into the opposite chair, "that certain questions must be asked, routine only. The mind, it requires order." "Of course." She folded her hands in her lap. "Though I must tell you, Mr. Poirot, that Dr. Colville has been quite clear on the matter. My aunt's fall was an accident. She was 71 and kept the house rather dimly lit. The staircase was steep. There is nothing mysterious here." "No doubt, no doubt." Poirot smiled his most amiable smile. "And yet you admit me." A pause, small but sharp. "I admit you because refusing you would seem peculiar." "Just so." He glanced around the room. "Your aunt had been in residence here." "How long since her return from abroad?" 6 months. A lengthy journey. She was in Switzerland. Her health required mountain air. Lady Imogen's eyes were steady on Poirot's face. They were remarkable eyes, dark, watchful, giving nothing. "She returned much improved." "You saw a change in her?" "A great improvement," Lady Imogen said. "She seemed rested, stronger." I formed the impression that she was answering the question she wished Poirot had asked, not the one he had. Before Poirot could pursue it, the door opened and 2 men entered together, or rather, one man entered and the other followed in his draught. The first was Major Edward Harland, broad, weathered, with the kind of face that years of outdoor management had turned to reliable leather. He moved like a man who had spent his life on estates and knew the ground beneath him. The second was Felix Durant, the private secretary, and he was everything Harland was not. Slight, fine-boned, with careful eyes, and the delicate deliberateness of a man who chose every word the way a jeweller selects stones, for what it catches and what it conceals. "Mr. Poirot." Harland extended a hand. His grip, I noted, was brief and firm. "Bad business, this. Her Grace was a formidable woman. We shall none of us see her like again." "You were long in her employ?" Poirot asked. 11 years, estate manager." Harland glanced at Lady Imogen. "Anything I can do to assist?" "You are most kind." Poirot turned to Durant, who stood slightly apart, one hand resting on the back of a chair. "And you, Monsieur Durand, you were the Duchess's private secretary." "I was." Durant's voice was pleasant, modulated. A radio announcer's voice, designed to be heard clearly and to reveal nothing. "For 7 years, Her Grace was extraordinarily capable in business matters. She required precision, and I endeavoured to provide it." "You handled her correspondence, her financial affairs?" "I facilitated the management of them, yes." A fine distinction, offered without hesitation. Poirot nodded as though satisfied. We were joined shortly after by Madame Élise Fournier, who entered with a small knock and remained near the door. A compact Frenchwoman of perhaps 50, with bright, cautious eyes, and the particular wariness of someone who has learned that households can turn. She had been the Duchess's personal maid for 8 months, she told Poirot. She had come with excellent references from a family in Lyon. "And before Lyon?" Poirot inquired. "A family in Brussels, monsieur." She met his gaze evenly. "For 3 years?" Poirot said no more on the subject. Dr. Colville arrived last, a trim man in his 50s, professionally unhurried. He had attended the Duchess for 2 years. Her heart had been unreliable, he told us. The fall, combined with the shock, had proved fatal. He had signed the death certificate without reservation. "She struck the lower newel post," he said. "The bruising was consistent. There was nothing to suggest." He paused delicately. "Any intervention?" "You are certain?" Poirot said. "I am." Colville held his gaze. "Completely?" Poirot thanked him. He thanked them all. He moved through the remainder of the visit with an air of gentle inconsequence, asking after the household arrangements, the Duchess's daily routine, the timing of meals. Nothing probing. Nothing that might cause alarm. It was only as we prepared to leave that he paused in the hallway, turning as if struck by an afterthought, and looked up at the private staircase that curved away above us into shadow. It was not a long flight, perhaps 14 steps. A polished mahogany rail, good carpet, well fitted. He looked at it for rather longer than an afterthought warranted. Then he settled his hat, thanked the butler, and stepped out into the street without a word. I fell into step beside him. The house receded behind us, silent and grey, releasing us with the same absence of expression with which it had received us. "Well," I said, "what did you make of it?" Poirot walked on a few paces. When he spoke, it was not in answer to my question. "That staircase, Hastings," he said quietly. "Good carpet, well fitted, excellent grip." He tapped his cane once on the pavement. "A woman does not fall on a staircase like that unless she is pushed, or unless she is not the woman who has walked it for 40 years. He said nothing further, but his green eyes, fixed on the middle distance, held the particular brightness of a man who has found in a tidy room the single thing that does not belong. Chapter 3. Small Things That Do Not Fit. Poirot returned to Montreval House the following morning, and he took me with him. He had obtained permission, through what combination of charm and quiet persistence I could not entirely account for, to examine the Duchess's private rooms. Lady Imogen had agreed with the same measured courtesy she applied to everything, as though refusal had occurred to her and been set aside for reasons of her own. The sitting-room was on the first floor, at the end of a corridor lined with portraits. Generations of Montrevals looked out from the walls with that particular aristocratic expression that manages to be both vacant and judgmental, eyes that followed one without appearing to move. I found the corridor disagreeable. Poirot naturally noticed nothing of the sort. He moved along it with his small, precise steps, hands clasped behind his back, reading the portraits as another man might read a timetable. The sitting room itself was pleasant enough. South-facing windows, good light, a writing desk near the fireplace, and 2 armchairs drawn close to it. The housemaids had been through. Everything was ordered, surfaces cleared, the grate swept. The kind of thorough tidying that in my experience is performed either from genuine respect or from the desire to leave no trace. Poirot stood in the centre of the room and turned a full, slow circle. Then he began. He did not hurry. He opened drawers with the care of a man who notes the resistance before he notes the contents. He lifted objects, replaced them with exactness. I watched from near the window, knowing better than to speak. It was the writing desk that held him longest. He pulled open the left-hand drawer, correspondence paper, a spare pen, a quantity of nibs, and then the right. Inside, neatly folded, lay a pair of cream kid gloves. He stood quite still over them for a moment. "Hastings," I crossed the room. "These gloves?" said Poirot. "Where should gloves be kept? Dressing room, I'd have thought, or a lady's bedroom." "Précisément." He did not touch them. He simply looked. "Not in a writing desk, not folded with this particular care. Look at the fingers, how they have been pressed flat, one inside the other. A woman who folds her gloves in a writing desk drawer is not a woman who has spent 40 years knowing exactly where things belong." He closed the drawer. Near the fireplace, on a small occasional table, sat a china bowl containing a few dried rose petals. The bowl placed as a decorative afterthought, the kind of thing one does not look at. Poirot looked at it. He turned over the handkerchief that lay beside it, a small square of fine lace with an embroidered border, and tilted it toward the window light. Near the corner of the handkerchief, almost invisible against the lace, a faint smudge. Yellowish, waxy, sitting on the surface of the fabric rather than soaked into it. "Grease paint," said Poirot. "Are you certain?" He lowered the handkerchief and looked at me with mild patience. "I am certain." He set it down with the same precision with which he had lifted it and moved to the writing desk once more, this time to the leather blotter on its surface. He lifted the blotter's edge. Nothing beneath it but the green felt backing, smooth and undisturbed. Poirot stood over it for a moment. Then he pressed the blotter flat again with one careful hand. "There was something here," he said. Not a question. "How can you possibly tell?" "The felt." He pointed. A small rectangular impression, faint but present. "Something lay beneath this blotter for some time. It has been removed." He straightened. "Recently." I turned to the mantelpiece, where a collection of small, framed photographs occupied one end. Most were formal. Official portraits, studio settings, the Duchess at various public occasions. But one stood slightly apart from the rest. An older photograph, sepia-toned, taken perhaps 20 or 25 years ago. The woman in it was younger, naturally, but that was not what struck me. "Poirot." I lifted the frame. The woman in the photograph stood in a garden, slightly turned from the camera, caught mid-laugh. It was unguarded, the laugh of someone who had forgotten to be formal. The face was strong, clear-eyed, with a set to the jaw, and a brightness in the expression that spoke of a personality that filled a room. Intelligence and humour right there in the image. I had seen no trace of that quality in the portraits recently hung in this house. "The Duchess?" I said slowly. 20 years ago? So the caption tells us. Poirot took the frame from me and studied it. And the Duchess of 6 months ago, the woman in the recent portrait on the landing, what did you observe of her expression? I thought of the formal oil painting we had passed in the corridor. Closed, correct, the face arranged for posterity. Quite different, I said. But that might simply be age. It might. Poirot set the photograph back on the mantelpiece, aligning it precisely with the edge of the shelf. Or it might be that a woman of strong character does not, in the ordinary way of things, lose that character entirely between one decade and the next. He looked at the photograph a moment longer. Even at 71, even in old age, the self persists. He moved to the window and looked down at the rear garden below. Bare trees, a stone path, the whole vista closed in and private. There is one further matter. He reached into his breast pocket and produced an envelope. Cream paper, good quality, addressed in a firm, distinctive hand, a hand that leaned slightly to the left, each letter formed with the confidence of someone who had written a great many letters and never doubted their own meaning. Monsieur Hercule Poirot, Whitehaven Mansions, London. This arrived at my flat this morning, Poirot said. Postmarked 4 days ago. It had been held at the sorting office. Incorrectly routed. He withdrew a single sheet of notepaper and held it out. The handwriting matched the envelope. Controlled, left-leaning, covering barely 4 lines. I have discovered something that cannot be spoken of at Montreval. I do not trust the post. I will come to you in person before the week is out. There is more at stake than you can presently know. M. I read it twice. M? I said. Who is M? Poirot took the letter back and folded it carefully. A question, Hastings, which I find most stimulating. He returned it to his breast pocket and looked again at the garden below. We attempted to trace Mrs. Amelia Brown, he continued. The address she gave, I asked Miss Lemon to write. The letter was returned. No such person at that address. No record of employment with any household in the relevant streets. I stared at the back of his head. Then who was she? Poirot clasped his hands behind him. In the garden below, a blackbird landed on the stone path, cocked its head, and flew away. That, my dear Hastings, he said, is the question upon which everything else depends. Chapter 4. The Arrangement. Felix Durand received us in the estate office on the ground floor. It was a room that suited him. Everything in it was ordered, cross-referenced, filed. Shelves of leather ledgers running floor to ceiling on 2 walls, correspondence trays, stacked with the rigour of a counting house, a room in which information was stored the way valuables are stored, accessible to those with the right key, invisible to everyone else. Durand sat behind the desk as though he had grown there, his jacket without a crease, his expression one of careful helpfulness. Poirot had requested the meeting on the pretext of clarifying the Duchess's financial arrangements for the purposes of— he had been vague about the purposes, in a way that managed to sound entirely official. Durand had agreed at once. That Poirot had mentioned to me on the way down the corridor was itself worth noting. "I am grateful for your time, Monsieur Durand," Poirot began, settling into the chair across the desk. "This is, I appreciate, a painful period. We are all of us doing our duty." Durand's hands rested flat on the desk. A deliberate stillness. A man who had trained himself not to fidget. "I wish to be as helpful as possible." "Excellent. Then perhaps you will tell me the Duchess, her affairs. She managed them herself, or did she rely upon you a great deal?" "A combination." Durand permitted himself a small, professional smile. Her Grace was formidably capable. She reviewed everything, questioned everything. I provided the machinery. She directed it. And during her time abroad, the Swiss stay, I maintained the estate affairs in her absence. She communicated by post and occasional telephone, and she would always write to me first on her returns, to prepare the accounts for her review before she arrived. It was a long-established habit. A considerable responsibility, said Poirot. She trusted me with it. Durant's tone carried no boast, just the flat weight of fact. He met Poirot's eyes without blinking, which was, I reflected, precisely what a man with something to hide would train himself to do. Poirot turned to the window. He appeared to study the narrow garden view for a moment, as though something there had caught his attention. When he turned back, his voice had dropped slightly, become almost conversational. "There is a matter," he said, "which I think you can help me with. A small thing. I mention it in confidence." He paused. "The woman who died on that staircase, was she the Duchess of Montrevel?" The room went very still. Durant's hands, still flat on the desk, pressed fractionally harder against the leather surface. It was the smallest possible movement. Anyone not watching for it would have missed it entirely. "I'm not certain I follow you," he said. "I think perhaps you do." Poirot's voice remained pleasant, his expression mild as a summer morning. "I think, Monsieur Durand, that you are an intelligent man. Intelligent men, in my experience, recognize when they are better served by honesty than by its opposite." He tilted his head. "The woman on the staircase, was she the Duchess?" A long pause. Durant stood, walked to the window, and stood with his back to us for a moment. The garden outside was still and pale. When he turned, his face had shifted, the professional helpfulness stripped back to something older and more tired beneath. "If I tell you what I know," he said, "I need your assurance that my position here, my role in this, is understood in its proper context." "I assure nothing," Poirot said pleasantly, "but I observe everything. So far, monsieur, what I observe suggests a man who has maintained a discretion required of him, rather than a man who has acted with malice. Whether that observation changes depends on what you now tell me." Durant was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved to me, a brief, measuring look. "I imagine, Mr. Poirot, that you have already spoken to certain theatrical circles, that Captain Hastings has been making inquiries of his own?" "Captain Hastings is most diligent," Poirot agreed. Durant gave a short nod, the nod of a man who has decided that controlled disclosure is the safer ground. He sat on the edge of the window-sill. "The arrangement existed for 15 years, he said. "The Duchess, the real Duchess, valued her privacy above almost everything. She had obligations, appearances, social duties that she described, in her own words, as a gilded cage. When she wished to travel freely, without ceremony, without the diplomatic obligations attached to her name, she required someone to maintain her public presence here in England." "A substitute," said Poirot. "An understudy." Durant looked at him steadily. "The term was always the Duchess's own. She was precise about what the arrangement was and what it was not. The woman she engaged was a former actress, experienced, discreet, capable of extraordinary accuracy in mimicry." "Her name?" "Dorothea Voss." I sat forward. "And Lady Imogen, did she know?" Durant's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Lady Imogen was informed. It was necessary for the arrangement to function." "And the financial management during these periods of absence?" Poirot asked. "Documents requiring signature, legal instruments, how were these handled?" "With great care." The words came out measured, spaced. "Miss Voss had authority to sign certain documents under specific conditions, conditions which the Duchess herself defined. But not unlimited authority? Absolutely not. A sharpness entered Durant's voice, the first real emotion in the room. The Duchess was meticulous. She reviewed everything on her return. Everything, Poirot repeated thoughtfully. He rose from the chair, clasped his hands behind his back, and moved with his small, precise steps toward the shelves of ledgers. His eyes travelled across the spines. You say she reviewed everything on her return? He glanced back at Durant. You speak in the past tense. Does that refer to previous returns, or to the most recent one? The question landed like a stone dropped into a well. Durant watched Poirot's back without answering. Because, Poirot continued, his voice entirely conversational, I find myself wondering whether, on this occasion, her return was quite as the household believed. He turned. And whether the reviewing she intended, and the scrutiny she planned to bring to the accounts, was in fact the reason she did not survive to perform it. Durant said nothing. His face had gone the colour of the November sky outside, flat, drained, carrying the particular blankness of a man who has just understood fully and for the first time the shape of the thing he has been standing inside. Poirot collected his hat from the desk. I thank you, Monsieur Durand, he said pleasantly. You have been most helpful. I may have further questions. I trust you will remain available. He moved toward the door, and I followed. In the corridor, as we passed the row of ancestral portraits, Poirot did not look up at them. He was already thinking about something else entirely. Chapter 5. The Staircase. Lady Imogen kept us waiting 12 minutes. I counted them by the carriage clock on the mantelpiece of the morning room where we sat. Poirot did not appear to count them. He sat with his hands folded, his eyes resting on the middle distance, his expression one of perfect patience. The patience of a man who has decided that whatever comes through the door will tell him something, and that the interval itself has already told him more. When she entered, she was dressed for going out, coat, gloves, a hat with a narrow brim. She drew off the gloves as she came in and sat across from us without apology for the wait. Mr. Poirot, you wish to see me? You were kind to spare the time, Poirot said. You were on your way out? I had an appointment. It will keep. Her dark eyes moved to me briefly, then back to Poirot. You have been speaking with Durant? We have. And now you come to me. Not a question. A statement of the inevitable, delivered without apparent anxiety. Then I imagine you have questions about the arrangement. I have questions, said Poirot, about a great many things. The arrangement is only one of them. He settled back fractionally in his chair. You were aware, Lady Imogen, of the existence of Miss Dorothea Voss. I was. No hesitation. My aunt informed me herself some years ago. She felt it prudent that at least one member of the family should know in the event of complications. And did complications arise? None that required my involvement. She crossed her ankles, her posture as correct as a ruled line. My aunt was a thorough woman. The arrangement functioned smoothly. Until this time, Poirot said. Until this time, she agreed. Her voice carried no inflection on the words, neither confirmation nor denial, simply the return of his own phrase intact. Poirot's eyes did not leave her face. Lady Imogen, I will ask you directly. In the weeks before the death, did you observe anything in your aunt's manner that struck you as changed? The pause lasted perhaps 3 seconds. She seemed more reserved than usual. Reserved, not unwell. No, quieter, more private. Lady Imogen's finger moved once along the seam of her glove, which she held folded in her lap. I remarked on it once. She told me she was occupied with estate matters. And you accepted that explanation? Her eyes met his. My aunt was not a woman who invited further inquiry. Poirot nodded as though this were entirely satisfactory. Then he turned to me. "Hastings! Perhaps you might tell Lady Imogen what you discovered yesterday." I had spent the previous afternoon at Poirot's direction, calling upon a theatrical acquaintance named Devereux, who had spent 40 years on the fringes of the London stage and knew everyone who had ever trod them. The name Dorothea Voss had produced an immediate response. A lean forward, a narrowing of eyes, the unmistakable posture of a man pulling something up from deep storage. She was remarkable, Devereux had told me. Character actress, could do accents, ages, bearing, the whole architecture of a person. Not famous, you understand, too precise for leading roles, but backstage among those who knew the craft. She was spoken of. He had paused then, turning his teacup. Dropped out of sight about 14 years ago. I assumed she'd gone abroad. Brussels, someone said. I relayed this to Lady Imogen. She listened without interruption, her expression unchanged. Miss Voss's last known address, I finished, was Brussels, which is where, I believe, the Duchess maintained a secondary residence. Lady Imogen looked at her folded gloves. Yes, she said, that is where the arrangement began. Poirot spoke quietly. The financial irregularities in the estate accounts, when did you first become aware of them? The gloves moved in her hands, a small, involuntary adjustment. I was not aware of any irregularities. No, that was Durant's domain. She raised her eyes. And my aunt's, of course. Poirot rose from his chair and moved to the window. He stood as he had stood at Montreval House 2 days before, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at a view that did not hold his attention. "There is a hotel in Bayswater," he said, his back still turned. "The Sefton, a quiet establishment, not fashionable, the kind of place where one is asked very few questions." Lady Imogen said nothing. "A woman took a room there 6 weeks ago. She gave her name as Mrs. Agnes Moore. She was in her 70s, lean, with grey eyes. She stayed alone. She took all her meals in her room." Poirot turned. "She was seen to leave the hotel on one occasion in plain dress, carrying a small bag. She did not return until the following evening. The following day she posted a letter. We believe it was not the only attempt at communication she made." He looked at Lady Imogen steadily. "She was found dead in that room 3 weeks ago. The cause was recorded as heart failure. She was buried under the name she had given. Her true identity, at that stage, unconfirmed." The morning room was very quiet. Lady Imogen sat absolutely still. A vein in her jaw moved once, as though she had closed her teeth together. "Where is the hotel now in this?" she asked. "The hotel manager has been most cooperative," said Poirot. "He remembered Mrs. Moore with some clarity. She was, he told me, a woman of considerable presence, despite everything she wore to conceal it." Lady Imogen stood. She moved to the fireplace and stood with one hand on the mantelpiece, her back partly to us. Not the posture of a woman composing herself, but of a woman deciding how much to surrender. "You believe," she said, "that the woman in the hotel was my aunt." "I do not believe it," Poirot said gently. "I know it." The fire in the grate had burned low. Outside, rain had begun against the window, a thin, persistent sound, like something trying to get in. Lady Imogen turned. Her face was composed still, but the effort of it was now visible, the way a dam is visible only when the water behind it rises high enough. "Then you also know," she said, "that the woman who died on that staircase was not." Poirot said nothing. He simply waited. A man who has asked his question and recognizes that the answer now will come of its own weight. Lady Imogen looked past him at the rain-darkened window. "I discovered it 3 weeks before she died," she said. "A locket, a small gold locket my aunt had worn every day of her life since I was a child. A private thing. She never removed it." Her voice was level, almost stripped. The woman in this house, the woman living here as her, did not have it. I searched her rooms. It was not there. She stopped. "I knew then." "What did you do?" Poirot asked. "Nothing." Lady Imogen met his eyes. "Not immediately. I needed to understand what I had found before I could decide what to do with it." Poirot regarded her for a long moment. "Yes," he said quietly. "I rather thought that was how it was." He collected his hat from the side table. The rain thickened against the glass, and from where I sat, watching Lady Imogen's hand press flat against the cold marble of the mantelpiece, I could not tell whether what moved behind her eyes was grief or something else entirely. Chapter 6. The Gathering at Montreval. The drawing-room at Montreval House held 5 people and a great deal of silence. Poirot had arranged the chairs himself, with Miss Lemon's characteristic precision translated into the physical. A loose semicircle facing the fireplace, no chair quite equal to another in its proximity to the centre. A small theatre. The fire burned steadily. The afternoon light, what remained of it, fell in pale strips across the carpet. I took my place near the window and watched them settle. Major Harland sat squarely, both feet on the floor, arms across his chest, a man waiting for something he expected to dislike. Madame Fournier occupied the chair nearest the door, her hands in her lap, her bright eyes moving from face to face like a bird that has heard a sound and cannot locate it. Dr. Colville had come with a stethoscope, still looped in his jacket pocket, as though he had been interrupted mid-call, and wished us to know it. He sat with the controlled impatience of a professional man whose time is being spent on matters beneath his professional concern. Felix Durand sat perfectly still. He had not looked at Lady Imogen since entering the room. Lady Imogen had chosen the chair furthest to the right, slightly outside the semicircle's natural arc, a fraction removed from the group, as though she had reserved the right to observe rather than participate. She wore black, as she had every day since the death. Her hands, I noticed, were very still. Poirot stood before the fireplace. He did not begin immediately. He let the room establish its own quiet, as one waits for water to settle before examining what lies beneath. "I thank you all for coming," he said at last. "What I have to tell you is not simple. It is, in parts, difficult. I ask only that you permit me to reach the end before you speak." Harland shifted in his chair. "Get on with it, then." Poirot inclined his head graciously. "The woman who died on this staircase 11 days ago was not the Duchess of Montreval." The room received this differently. Harland's brows drew together sharply. Colville's hand moved to his jacket lapel and stopped. Madame Fournier shut her eyes for a moment, just a moment, and opened them again. Durand looked at the floor. Lady Imogen looked at Poirot. "Her name was Dorothea Voss," Poirot continued. "She was a character actress of considerable skill, engaged by the real Duchess some 15 years ago to maintain a public presence in England during the Duchess's private travels abroad. The arrangement was known to 3 people in this household, the Duchess herself, Monsieur Durand, and Lady Imogen." Harland turned to Durand. "You knew about this?" Durand said nothing. "The arrangement," Poirot said, drawing Harland's attention back, "was for many years a private eccentricity. Unusual, yes. Improper, perhaps. Criminal, no. But arrangements have a habit of changing their nature when the people within them change their intentions." He moved from the fireplace and stood before the shelves of ledgers on the far wall. 18 months ago, someone began drawing from the Montreval estate accounts. Small amounts at first, then larger, routed through a subsidiary holding, reclassified in the ledgers under a category that required the Duchess's countersignature, a signature which, of course, Miss Voss was in a position to provide. Durant's jaw tightened, a single, visible movement. The real Duchess discovered the irregularities, Poirot said. Not through the official accounts, those had been tidied with some skill, but through a private record she had maintained for decades, a parallel ledger kept in her own hand against which she checked the estate figures on every return. He turned. She did not confront anyone here. She was a thorough woman and a careful one. Instead, she came to England quietly, not to Montreval House, but to a small hotel in Bayswater, under an assumed name. She watched, she gathered, she came to me. Madame Fournier pressed her handkerchief to her mouth. "She was the woman you called Mrs. Brown," Harland said slowly. Not a question. He was assembling something piece by piece and did not like the picture forming. She was. She had discovered the financial scheme and she suspected the hand behind it. She intended to come to me with the full evidence. Poirot's voice dropped. She did not have the chance. She was found dead in her hotel room, poison administered in the tea left outside her door, quiet, certain. The death recorded as heart failure, the burial arranged under the name she had given. He paused. She had been murdered before she could act. Colville sat forward. "You're saying she was poisoned, and I signed—" "You signed the death certificate of a woman you believed to be an unknown elderly resident of modest means," Poirot said. "You were not deceived by design. You had no reason to look further." He moved on before Colville could speak again. With the real Duchess gone, Miss Voss continued in her role. She believed herself secure. But security, for a woman living another person's life, is a most fragile condition. He stopped in front of Lady Imogen. 3 weeks before the death on the staircase, he said, you discovered that the woman living in this house was not your aunt. The room turned to Lady Imogen as one body. "The locket," she said. Her voice was steady and entirely flat, the voice of someone who has decided that steadiness is all that remains to her. "My aunt wore it every day of her life. It held 2 photographs, my grandfather and a child who died in infancy. She had told me once she would be buried in it." She stopped. "The woman here did not have it. I searched her rooms. It was not there. That was when I knew." "What did you do?" Harland demanded. Lady Imogen did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Poirot, as though he were the only fixed point in the room. "I confronted her. Not openly. I was not prepared to expose what I had found without understanding what it meant for the family, for the estate. I waited until one evening when the house was quiet. I went to her on the upper landing." Poirot spoke softly. "And she did not deny it. No, she did not deny it. Something moved across Lady Imogen's face, not grief, not guilt, but a composite of both, pressed together under enormous force. She told me there were things I did not understand and would not understand, that the family's interests had been preserved and that I should leave well enough alone." Her hand closed on the arm of the chair. She attempted to pass me and reach the corridor. I took hold of her arm. There was a struggle. It was brief. She stopped. She fell. The fire clicked. Somewhere outside, a motor car passed. "I did not intend her to die," Lady Imogen said. "That is the truth, whatever you make of it." "And the real Duchess?" Harland's voice was raw. "Your aunt. You knew she was in that hotel, and you—" "I did not know she was there." Lady Imogen's composure fractured then, not dramatically, but the way old stone fractures, a single line deep and irreparable. I did not know she was in England. I did not know she had come back. I discovered what that woman was, and I tried to stop her, and it went wrong. She turned to Poirot. "I have told you the truth." "Yes," said Poirot quietly. "I believe you have." Durand had not spoken since the room assembled. He sat now with his elbows on his knees, his face in his hands, the posture of a man who has watched a structure he built, brick by careful brick, come down around him in a single afternoon. Poirot looked at him for a long moment. "The scheme was yours, Monsieur Durand." "Not Miss Voss's. She was the instrument." "The financial architecture was the work of a man who understood the accounts intimately, who knew precisely which reclassifications would pass unnoticed, and which required careful arrangement." Poirot's voice carried no anger, only the settled weight of conclusion. "When the real Duchess began to investigate, you could not allow it to proceed. The poison was not Miss Voss's work." Durand raised his head. His face was a map of exhaustion. "She came to you," Poirot said. "The real Duchess. She wrote to you first, as she always did on her returns, to prepare the accounts for review. 7 years of the same habit. She trusted you with the letter before she trusted anyone else with her presence." He let that sit for a moment. "And you used it." The drawing-room held its silence. The fire had burned to a low, steady glow. Outside, the last of the afternoon light had gone entirely, and Montreval House stood in the early dark as it always had, composed, correct, and utterly without expression. Poirot moved to the door and opened it. 2 men waited in the hallway. He looked back at the room, at Harlan's rigid indignation, Colville's stricken face, Madame Fournier weeping quietly into her handkerchief, Durand motionless in his chair, and Lady Imogen, her hand still on the arm of the chair, watching him with the eyes of a woman who has told the truth and is not yet certain whether it will save her or destroy her. "The little grey cells," Poirot said almost to himself. "They do not judge, they only see." He stepped aside to let the men from the hallway enter. "The judging, that is for others." Epilogue. The true identity of the woman buried in Bayswater was confirmed on the 14th of November in a small churchyard beneath a stone that read, "Agnes More, Beloved." The grave had been neatly kept. Someone, the hotel manager, it later emerged, who had taken a quiet liking to his reserved elderly guest, had placed a pot of white chrysanthemums at its foot. The discovery made 3 paragraphs in the better papers and considerably more in the worse ones. Felix Durand was arrested on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and the willful administration of poison. He offered no defence at the preliminary hearing beyond the statement that he had acted to protect arrangements which had been, in their original form, entirely legitimate. The magistrate received this observation with the expression of a man who has heard a great many such statements and found none of them satisfactory. Lady Imogen Vane's case proved, as Poirot had predicted, a matter of unusual legal complexity. The woman she had pushed from the staircase was not who she had appeared to be, had been living under a false identity, and had herself been party to a scheme that had cost the real Duchess her life. The precise charge that would attach to Lady Imogen's action, and whether it would attach at all, occupied a considerable number of legal minds for a considerable number of months. She remained at Montreval House throughout under conditions that were never publicly described, maintaining her composure with the thoroughness of a woman who has decided that composure is the last thing she owns. The estate itself entered probate and stayed there, tangled in questions of authority, signature, and legitimacy that the courts would spend years carefully unpicking. Montreval House was closed by December. The portraits in the corridor were sheeted over. The silver was locked away. Madame Fournier returned to Lyon. Major Harland wrote twice to Poirot, once to express his indignation at having been deceived for the better part of a year by a woman he had taken orders from, and once, 3 weeks later, to apologize for the first letter. Dr. Colville amended his professional records in silence and spoke to no journalist who approached him. It was a grey morning in late November when Poirot and I descended the steps of Montreval House for the last time. The chrysanthemums in the window boxes had died with the first frost. The door behind us was already locked. I turned up my collar against the cold. We walked in silence to the end of the street before I spoke. 2 women, I said. 1 life between them, and neither one safe in it. No. Poirot was quiet for a moment, his breath misting in the cold air. The real Duchess understood the danger, and that is why she came to me. What she did not anticipate was that the danger had already passed her by and found someone else to settle upon. Dorothea Voss, who was in the end destroyed by the same deception she had sustained. He paused at the corner. Deception is not a stable structure, Hastings. One builds it carefully, well, 1 brick, then another, and it stands, and it holds, and one grows confident in it. He looked back once at the grave face of Montreval House. But a structure built on the wrong foundation does not require a great force to bring it down, only time or a single small truth applied in the right place. He adjusted his gloves with the small, precise movements that I had watched 10,000 times across 20 years, and which still struck me, in moments like this one, as the outward expression of a mind that was always, quietly, putting something in order. Rank, he said, turning from the house, is only a costume, and the great danger is not in wearing the costume, it is in forgetting, after so many years, that one is wearing it at all. We walked on into the grey morning, and Montreval House receded behind us, silent, as it had always been, giving nothing away. Thank you for listening to Duchess in Disguise here on Café Stories. I hope you enjoyed this story as much as we enjoyed bringing it to you. A case that reminds us how easily identity can be constructed and how dangerous it becomes when people begin to believe in the role they are playing. If this mystery stayed with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with fellow lovers of detective stories. And as mentioned earlier, Café Stories is currently demonetized by YouTube. If these stories mean something to you, supporting through Patreon is the only way to keep them going. You'll find the link in the description. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, stay observant, stay curious, and remember, the most dangerous disguise is the one that no one questions. Thank you for listening to Café Stories.